All right, so now we're going to move on in the book, and we're going to talk about the next person who she's interested in. Is this guy, Heinz Kohut. And he was around until the 80s, and he has this whole thing, self-theory, suggests that children need to have their talk and accomplishments acknowledged. So this idea that children need to be mirrored. He talked a lot about mirrored. Have their talks and accomplishments acknowledged, accepted, and praised. And little children, he says, believe they're omnipotent and they idealize their parents. This idealization helps them to develop goals. Okay? In most time, the children learn to know their idealized notions are incorrect, and they substitute a more realistic assessment of themselves and their parents. Again, this is the same kind of object relations thing I'm telling you about, right? Except this includes this idea, these kind of superego ideas where the ego ideal starts out as being unrealistic, and then later on, for the children, as they become more interacting with the world, things become more realistic. Okay, and doing this successfully requires the parents to have this relationship with the kids in an appropriate way, where they respond positively to what their children are doing, and this can the children experience themselves as being lovable and having good characteristics, and this helps the children develop normally. If the children don't do this, the children may be unable to develop a good sense of self-worth and may spend the rest of their lives looking without success for acceptance. And Kohut talked a lot about narcissistic individuals. This is where his idea, where narcissism comes from. He says narcissistic individuals are looking for an idealized parent substitute that can never be found. I half believe this, half don't believe this. I'm going to talk to you much more detail about narcissism later on, so I'll save that discussion for then. But this is the idea. They're looking for an idealized parent that doesn't exist. I would personally change that and say the narcissist maybe is looking for idealized parenting or the parenting experience that they didn't have. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, in ideal development, Kohut says this thing called the nuclear self, the preliminary core to the self, emerges in the second year, and he believes that it's bipolar. There's two polar things here that create a tension that fosters development of early skills and talents. And again, you need supportive and empathetic family members to permit this to grow and become more cohesive. And it becomes an autonomous self. It goes from nuclear to autonomous, which is a more established self. Okay? Autonomous self is healthy, independent, flexible in its interpersonal relationships. Object like this trauma can lead to pathological delay and stunting of emotional growth and ego formation. Psychopathology, expression of traumatic self-object internalizations. From childhood, they're acted out in current relationships. I think that's what we basically said. He's just saying it in a little bit different way. Okay, Kohut focused on narcissism and narcissistic character disorders that occur when an individual fails to develop an independent sense of self. And he theorized there's kind of a separate line of development that it can occur distinct from and before ego and psychosexual development. So in this early object relations phase, what we talked about with Mahler, what Kohut's saying is that there's a line of pathological development that could lead to narcissism. And I'll talk more about that later on too. I think it's very interesting. Okay, and again, as you know, narcissistic personality is characterized by an exaggerated sense of self-importance and self-involvement, and they hide a fragile sense of self-worth. They can be an overcompensation. That's one form of narcissism, so we'll talk more about that too. Libido is withdrawn from, Eros is withdrawn from external objects by the narcissist. Everything is revolving about them, and so this makes it hard to have a therapeutic relationship with them because it makes the transference weird. And Kohut was one of the first people to talk about specialized transference that therapists can engender with their patients who are narcissistic and use those as therapy. And the big important one he talked about was this mirroring transference. That again, you are doing that, the little child got mirroring from their parents. and you can do that as a therapist with the narcissistic client. You can engender this mirroring transference, and that will help you establish a rapport with them, because they're very difficult to establish a rapport with. Okay, what else to say about Kohut? I think that's the basic stuff. You can read a little more detail in the book, and we'll talk about narcissism a little bit later on. I'll try to give you something a little more comprehensive about narcissism. Otto Kernberg, somebody who highly influenced me. I like his stuff quite a lot. And Kernberg talked about a lot of people. He talked about people with narcissism and people with borderline personality disorder a lot. That was really his specialty area. And he talks a lot about this idea of splitting as related to interpersonal relationships with borderline individuals. I think I talked to you guys already a little bit about that. This idea that this becomes a defense mechanism, that the person is unable to integrate these internalized objects with one another, or if they are integrated, they're poorly integrated, and then under periods of stress and trauma, they will split these things into all good or bad. And this is part of the interaction with people who are borderline with borderline personality disorder. Okay? This is part of one of the things that makes them very difficult to work with. So I had a patient who was borderline. I would show up one day for a therapy session, and she would tell me I was the greatest person in the world, I was the most wonderful therapist, I was a saint, I walked on water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then she would come in the next week, and I was the worst person in the world, I was a piece of crap, she was going to sue me, I was the worst therapist in the world, I shouldn't be practicing, I should lose my license, I should be put in jail because I was just such a terrible person. And I would say to her, but last week you were telling me how great I was, and she would say, no, I wasn't, I would never say that, you're horrible. And then, a week or two would go by, and she'd show up, and I was the best person again. This is a splitting defense. Okay, this is splitting. And so this is one thing when you do therapy with borderline individuals, you have to be able to, first of all, as a therapist, to tolerate this kind of splitting defense, because it's very annoying. And you also have to do a form of therapy that Kernberg did, which really modified the sort of standard psychoanalytic technique, which people with personality disorders really can't tolerate very well. And he modified it in a couple ways. One is to make the therapy a container. Okay, that you have to, that people who are, especially with borderline personality disorder, who work with Kernberg, have to be able to tolerate the containment of the therapy session. That means they have to be willing to agree to not act out, to be able to control themselves to the point where they're not acting out, and that they're showing up for therapy, they're doing things, and they have to make an agreement with Kernberg. And he would say, if you can do this, then you can do therapy. And he would form a container. He would form the therapy to be much more structured. And then part of the therapy with him, too, then would be to make it so to modify the standard, very neutral psychoanalytic stance with the patient, and instead be a little bit more supportive of them, at least in the beginning, and to establish a rapport with them so that you can get the transference started. Because it's the transference, it's the relationship with the therapist that's going to correct the poor early childhood relationship that the person with the personality disorder had when they were a child. Okay? And so this is what he would do. So he had this technique of this kind of thing. Okay? And he would probably see people 2 or more times a week, and the therapist is a lot more active. It's a lot more, we would say, active supportive. He's a lot more talking to the person and talking about current behavior rather than past events. Okay? And then this again will engender this transference. The transference is going to be very rocky for the therapist with a borderline person, because it's going to have to do the splitting stuff. So the therapist has to be able to sort of contain this and to tolerate it. And this is why I always tell people, if you're going to work with personality disordered individuals, you need to get training in this. You can't just have your standard psychotherapy training and just go start seeing people with personality disorders, because you are not going to be able to tolerate this stuff. I would go see borderline clients, and I would feel afterward like I was run over by a train. It was very emotionally draining for me as a therapist. And so you need training in it, okay? You need training in it, which a lot of people don't get. Because you also have to sort of tolerate the patient's distorted views of not only yourself, but also reality, and you need to be able to sort of talk to them about this kind of stuff. Okay? But it's the relationship that is developed with the patient that then eventually gets internalized by that patient that creates the cure. It's the relationship with the therapist that creates the cure. This is actually, a lot of psychoanalytic thinkers believe that all psychoanalytic, all psychodynamic therapies, and actually even other non-psychodynamic therapies, work through having this sort of corrective relationship. Okay? The earlier the trauma, the longer it's going to take to correct the relationship. It just takes a long time. Because things are wired in the brain, it takes a long time. But this is the idea that, and again, this is why in psychodynamic therapies, transference is so important, but you got to need to know what kind of transference your client, your patient is going to have with you. Okay, and it's also why you need to have gone through your therapy yourself, because you're going to have counter-transference. And so you don't want to get caught off guard. It's very, very important. But it is the relationship that cures. Okay? The relationship that cures. That relationship motivated by, driven by internal drives, which create internal representations that the person has of their reality, of people in their reality, that then you as a therapist work on to help cure. So again, no artificial distinction between relationships and drives here. Okay? In classical, or at least standard psychoanalytic object relations therapy, the relationship is incredibly important. So when you read the other chapter on relational cultural theory, they talk about relationships being important, and psychoanalysis doesn't deal in relationships. Not true. Okay, absolutely not true. It's the relationship that cures, and this is what Kernberg is saying specifically. Okay? Kernberg also talks about in borderline personality disorders, aggression is a major motivating force. And so you see a lot of, because of the splitting thing, the aggression is not modulated. And so aggression comes with, if you have a borderline client, you can expect at some point some hostility and aggression, actually very intense hostility, very intense aggression coming from your client, and it's at some point that's going to be focused on you as a therapist. You have to be able to contain that. Okay? And this is if you even see like somebody and they come in and they have a standard Oedipal issue, but there's a lot of hostility, and a lot of aggression in that Oedipal constellation in the person, you can suspect that there's early object relation things that went on with this person. That's a sort of a red flag. The Oedipal complex tinged with tremendous amounts of hostility, something earlier in object relations went on. So what you want to do as a therapist is work back to that earlier stuff and try to get at that. Then you can help the person reconstitute the Oedipal situation without all the hostility and aggression. But it takes a lot of time. Yes, Julie?
The person with borderline who's acting out in aggression, do you think they feel on their side they're doing it as a defense?
People with personality disorders and borderline personality disorders do not have the ability to reflect on why they're doing things. So those of us who have relatively well put together personalities and egos, we all have the capacity to reflect on ourselves. Like, let's say, you got up in the morning, and you were driving to school and somebody cut you off. You'd had a bad night, you were pissed off at somebody in your family, you had a bad night, so somebody cuts you off and you're rolling down the window like, road rage, full on, you pull out your Glock 9mm out of your glove compartment, take a couple shots at the guy, and then you get to school and you realize, oh wow, I was really pissed off. Oh, no wonder, I had a really bad day yesterday, that's why I'm so pissed. But you have the realization of why you were mad. Oh, I was mad because I really had a bad day, I really shouldn't have done that. Right, I shouldn't have flown off the handle. I had a bad day yesterday. I really need to keep. We've all had this. I really need to keep tabs on myself. I need to check that. I don't want to do that next time. Not good to pull the gun out of the car and start shooting things. They really not need to not do that. That's, by the way, a fabricated example. Hopefully none of you are going to do that. But you know what I'm talking about, right? You got pissed off, you said something snipey to somebody, you go, I really didn't mean to do it. You might go apologize to the person, I'm really sorry, I had a really bad night last night, I was just pissed off, it wasn't about you. You have that ability to reflect on your actions and your emotions and then understand them. Somebody with borderline personality disorder, real borderline personality disorder, does not have that ability. They are dissociated from that, okay? And so the splitting has a real dissociative quality to it. Okay? They don't realize, like my patient, she didn't realize she was being mean to me. She was being nice. I said, well, you were really mean to me the other day. Oh, no, I wasn't. That's hardcore. So this is what we're talking about here. Okay? The dissociative quality. Okay. So we could talk a lot about Kernberg all day. I really like his work. I got a bunch of his books up in my office. Very, very interesting guy, very interesting thinker. I think a very good writer. He writes very clearly, so I recommend him. If I ever teach the Foundations of Counseling Theory class in this university, I will probably spend a lot of time on Kernberg. Of course, then you'll go to graduate school and you'll never hear about him again. But that's... Anyway, very interesting guy. I like him a lot. Let's talk about Nancy Chodorow, who is another very interesting person who I like tremendously, and also somebody who knows my dad. They've done some stuff together, I believe. She is essentially I would call her the mother of feminist psychoanalysis. And she is the one who is almost, not single-handedly, but one of the people who really began the idea, sort of following Karen Horney, but whereas where Karen Horney might seem to be sort of really outside the mainstream of analysis, Nancy Chodorow now is really seen within the mainstream of psychoanalysis, or object relations theory. And she really also really emphasizes the role of the mother, and that mothers have a really, really, really important role in the development of children. And especially this early object relations era, that mothers really play the key role here, not just with their daughters. The daughters are very important, but also with their sons. And that there's a whole line of development that comes from this. And she talks about the reproduction of mothering, a cyclical process by which the mother-daughter relationship instills the daughter with the desire to take on the role of the mother. And this has a lot of things to do. This also represents the desire to establish relationships and have competence in negotiating and having relationships with other people. Okay. She talks about the early relationship between mother and infancy, establish a basis for parenting in children of both sexes, the expectation that women will mother. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have to become a mother when you get older, but this is a biological expectation. Again, we talked about before, womb envy and the idea of women having this procreative ability. And a way you can look at Nancy Chodorow's work to say that mothers awaken this ability within their daughters. Okay? And mothering meets a woman's psychological need for reciprocal intimacy initiated during her own infancy, when she and her mother saw one another as extensions of themselves. So again, as a woman will experience when she's an infant with her mother, again, when she becomes a mother, she will then have that experience with her own infant. This idea of this very intimate reciprocal relationship. Okay? Now, mothers are also close to their baby sons, but they see their sons as dissimilar and do not experience the same feeling of oneness that they have with their daughters. This is an interesting statement. I think this is a little controversial, but it's very interesting. Boys' nurturing abilities are methodically limited and repressed as they are prepared to work outside the family. Okay? So this is sort of the standard gender roles. Okay? It doesn't mean that boys can't be nurturing or that women can't work outside the family. So this is just the sort of standard way that this has occurred. Okay? So the psyche develops different in men and women. The process entails individual and emotional fantasy-related materials that arise in the course of psychoanalytic development, as well as stuff from the outside, from social influences. Establishment of gender identity occurs in the pre-Oedipal period, and there are sex differences in the Oedipal experience because of this awareness. Women's personality develops in a way that emphasizes ongoing interpersonal relationships. Men grow to see themselves as distinct and separate. So again, a way this kind of echoes another way of saying that expressing that womb in the idea of Karen Horney, right? The men have this realization that they're not like women. They can't do the same thing as women. It may not be that they can have babies, but it may be that they can't quite have the same intimacy in their relationships and empathy and reciprocity in relationships as girls can do. And this is engendered by the mother. The mother does not treat the sons the same way because they're different. What else to say here? Okay. Sense of gender is a fusion of personal and cultural meaning. Happens very early on, within the first couple of years. Now, of course, we know that gender identity has something to do with the brain and hormones in the brain and all sorts of things. Those of you taking my clinical psych section next part of the summer, I will talk a lot about intersex individuals, and because that's an area that's getting a lot of interest right now. And it's really quite fascinating. And there's a really lot of different kinds of gender things that go on that have to relate to the brain and development. And the gender that you're attracted to may be different than the gender of your identity, or maybe the same. The gender of your identity may be very different than the gender of the body that you're born into. And there's all sorts of everything, gray areas and everything in between. So I'll go into a lot of detail about that next semester or next session if anybody's taking that other class. There's a wonderful diagram. Let me show the diagram here. Here it is, yes. This is the reproduction of mothering diagram. I kind of like this. You can see home, primary parenting done by the mother, establishing gender identity, mother and daughter share sense of sameness, relational activities emphasized, need for reciprocal intimacy, desire and capability to parent, interest in domestic sphere, go in here. Or you can say in the public sphere, parenting done by the mother establishes gender identity, mother and sons share a sense of difference, non-relational activities emphasize repression of relational needs, lack of desire to be parents, entrance into public sphere, redefines self as the male. So this is the sort of standard things. Now I look at this and I think this is like a kind of 1950s version of looking at mothers and their sons and daughters. The mom stays home and does these relational things, and the boy, doesn't do relational things and gets sort of socialized to go outside the home and do things. That sons, grow up not to be very interested in being parents. That's where, all the girls want to be mommies, So I think you can take this diagram and you can sense in a more modern way, I would do this, I would sense in a more modern way that, really, that maybe this woman doesn't want to become a mother. Maybe she has a need for reciprocal intimacy and reciprocal, more intense relationships, and so she goes and has a job where she is creative, and she uses those ability to make these relationships in a creative way in her work in the public sphere. So I would not separate public and private so much in these things. I think the developmental lines are very interesting and make a lot of sense, because we even have biological evidence for this kind of thing. But I think to separate and say home and public does not make sense to me. Women could be doing this at work, right? Men could be doing this, maybe in the home in some way, And maybe because men are repressing, they're not being so good at relational things, maybe they're better at other stuff, right? And I think what she's highlighting here really the sex differences. So I would take the public and private sphere with a little bit of grain of salt. Does that make sense? So to you guys, the women in the class, can you think of your own life where you had ability to have very intense empathetic relationships with other women that was in some way helpful to you? What do you think of something like that? Should I give you an example? Okay. So let's say you're a certain age and you're consciously or unconsciously looking for a romantic partner. You go out to the bar at night, or you go to a party. And remember I gave you the scenario before? This side of the bar, there's the biker guy, mean-looking tough guy, Hell's Angel patch on his back, drinking whiskey, half drunk, cussing out. Here's the nice engineering major over here. Perfect father material. He's going to have a good job. He's clean, neat, knows how to fix things around the house, not bad looking. And a lot of women will go, the bad guy, right? The bad boy. But let's say you're there at the bar. First of all, who are you going to be there with? Your friends, your female friends, probably. And so let's say you go over and you talk to bad boy over here. You go, oh, he's so bad. Oh, he's so cute, right? And then what do? You go back to your female friends, and what do you say? What do you think of him? Right? Your female friends help you vet this guy. Anybody have this experience? It doesn't have to be the biker, it could be any guy, right? It's a guy, you're at a party, it's a guy you like, you talk to him for a few minutes, then what do you do? I know you guys have done this. What do you do?
Gossip.
How? What do you say?
You call your friends and ask.
You say, what do you think of him? Right? And then what do your friends do?
They analyze.
They analyze. And they might even go collect more data. They might go and they might talk to the guy themselves.
Yeah, that's why they're your friends.
Yeah, and then they come back and then what do they tell you?
Their result.
Yeah, what do they conclude? They tell you, bad boy, no. They're good friends, what do they do? They'll say, yeah, go out with that guy. He's riding his motorcycle drunk at home, right? No, what they'll say, they say, stay away from that guy. Let me introduce you to this other guy over here, right? Your friends will vet. And so women have the ability to read each other's emotions and express in these intimate relationships and conversations a lot of emotional stuff that men have a much harder time with. Men can do it too, it's just a hard time. The guys are in a bar. There's a girl you like, right? You go over, you talk to her for a few minutes. If you come back, if you bother to come back and talk to your guy friends, how's the conversation go? Right? You look at it, your friend, and go, yeah, she's hot. Grunt. And that's it. Right? It's like, and then we'll start talking about cars or something, right? That's a guy's conversation. Women will have a long, lengthy conversation, vet the guy, what does he do? They'll really get into it. It's now, biology has shown that women are actually hardwired for this. Women have much better language capabilities. This is why women develop better language capabilities, or better in languages than men. Okay? And again, this facilitates this ability to have these reciprocal, intimate relationships with each other. And this is a survival thing. This is evolutionary. It's survival. Because if you pick bad boy over there, not only is he going to go cheat on you and not give you resources for your baby, but he may beat you up and the baby up too, right? And so you make bad choices, you don't pass your genes on. Those women, primate women who went and conferred with their friends, had these reciprocal, intimate relationships, ability to communicate emotional states and these intimate states to each other, were ones who were able to pick better husbands or better mates, and then they were the ones who were able to pass their genes on better. So this is something that has been passed on. And women who had the language ability to do this, the parts of the brain that function with language, had a better ability to do this. It had survival value, and that's why we see it now. So Chotaro's thing here, to me, has an underlying biological basis to it. And you can see this in women. You see this in women's behavior. Okay? And so I it's very interesting, right? And you can also see the guy part. We're out at a bar, we're hanging out, we're not talking about our relationship with each other and our friendships and all these intimate emotional things. We're there basically. Men pick up romantic partners basically based mostly on visual cues. Hot or not. That's what they're doing, and then whatever. They're really discussing it. You ever had a guy friend started going out with a girl and maybe you might say to your friends, hey, that's a mistake, right? And that's all you ever said about it. Right, and you knew that you had some relational insight, but you didn't bother to share it with your friends. And guys do this all the time. It's kind of guy code not to diss somebody's girlfriend, right? But women, you'll talk about guys, really intimate things about guys to each other all the time, right? Right? You have a boyfriend, your girlfriend will say, how's it going? And you'll just talk about everything, right? By the way, guys, your girlfriends are talking about you to their girlfriends. Everything about you, you think is only she knows. You're constantly being vetted. okay? And women are good at this. This is, because why would women do this? Because the result of this mating, these for our primate ancestors, was having babies. And so women have a tremendous investment in this child. It's 9 months carrying it in their body, not to mention raising it and all these other things they have going on. They have a tremendous investment in this. There's much more pressure on them to make sure their partner is good material than for guys, right? So women have developed this. I mean, there's a survival value in this. And women are really smart, right? That makes sense? You guys experience this? Yeah. Now, if you don't experience this, if you're a woman who doesn't vet your partners with friends, then you run the risk, in my opinion, of picking bad partners. And so one thing, I've actually was talking to Tracy a little bit about this. One thing that I thought about is like having one thing I would counsel women who are interested in, I want to get married, I want to have a baby, or whatever. I would say, or somebody comes to me in therapy and say, I can't seem to have a good relationship. I always pick these terrible guys. The first thing I would ask them is, how's your vetting practice going? How do you vet these guys? Oh, I don't know. I just like the fact he had a black leather jacket on and rode a motorcycle. So that was my criterion. What did your friends think about it? What friends? Then right there, I know there's an issue. So one thing I would teach women as a therapist is that to engage in this vetting practice. Very important, right? And if you're not able to do that, why not? What happened, again, maybe in the relationship with your mother, that this didn't get engendered somehow, from a Nancy Chodorow point of view. Okay. That makes sense? So this is very interesting stuff. So what she's saying here is that the mother is really super important. The mother, in some ways, it's implied the mother is more important than the father, especially in the early stages of development. Yes?
I think that's why you can have better conversations with guys. At least they'll talk about politics and stuff like that, and women, you'll hear them talking about nonsense.
Well, you could have, if you have a political discussion with women, it's more likely to be based around feelings and emotions and sort of more intimate things with each other. A lot of the overt things get communicated sort of unconsciously. But again, I'm not a big believer in political discussions because I don't think it changes anything. But yeah, guys, there's not a lot of necessarily emotional underpinning in talking, especially a guy that you don't know real well as a friend. There's not a lot of emotional underpinning in that relationship, so you just talk about external things maybe more easily. At least according to Nancy Chodorow, that would be the case. Okay? It's an interesting idea. But what the takeaway from this is that that women are really important here. Okay, women are really important here. And of course, there are lots of contradictions and strains in this. It doesn't go so smoothly as this. This is sort of the ideal thing, but there's a lot of contradictions in development. And so again, it's not necessarily so smooth as this, but this is the sort of overall pattern. So any questions about this? He's really put the mother at the key of this. The mothering is much more important than the father at this early stage of development. And this early stage of development really is the thing that's establishing, the child, the identity in the child. So the mothers are really more important than the fathers. This flips Freud sort of on his head, right? Freud talked about the fathering in the Oedipal complex being so important. Chodorow is saying, no, the early stuff is more important. And that has to do with the mother. Katie.
So have they done studies on if there's a single parent and that parent is a father?
Really what they will say is that they really talk about the primary caretaker. So if it's the father who is the single parent, is the father mothering that child like a mother would, or is the father fathering that child like a father? Is it something in between? Would it make a difference? Would a girl who's raised by a father, a single father, have less ability to have intimate relationships with other women or not? I don't know if there's any research on that. I imagine somebody's probably looked into that. That would be a very, very good project to do, a dissertation project, if it hasn't been done. Because from Nancy Chodorow's point of view, there would probably, I think she would hypothesize there would be a difference. Doesn't necessarily mean that that girl is going to be, disabled. But she may have a less of ability to form those intimate relationships. Julie?
But then it would also depend on the extended family too, because if
Yeah.
there was a big grandmother.
Is there somebody else there who's taking on the
Yeah.
mothering role, teaching that girl mothering? Is the father the single parent, but the little girl hangs out with the grandmother all the time, you know? So there's other, so parenting is not, you know, we make it more simplistic by saying mom and dad, but the truth is that parents can play, and many people in the child's life can play roles of doing those things. So maybe the little girl doesn't get it from mom, but maybe she gets it from a grandmother or dad's girlfriend, or, you know, somebody else in the family, or somebody, you know, that's in the sphere of influence, right? And likewise with fathers, right? Same kind of deal.
Is there really an important role for fathers in the child's life
Yeah,
then?
the role for the father comes later, you know, it's sort of like the end of this, in the end of the object relation stage. When the kid's 2 to 3 years old, the father then is the one who starts mediating that kid having relationships outside the dyad of the mother. This doesn't come from Nancy Choder or any of the people in the book, but this comes from other people who talked about this, Freudians who've talked about this. The father then is the one who introduces that kid to the outside world at large, right? And so again, this also fits in with a little bit later on with, you know, the Oedipal situation, creating anxiety, you know, interacting with two parents rather than one parent, and these kind of things. And the resolution of the Oedipal conflict is the kid then goes and is able to start integrating into society. And so the father initiates that process, but that comes along a bit later. Okay? So this early stuff that establishes all these things, this period where the kid's establishing gender identity and all these basic things, for Chodorow, that the mother is really of the supreme importance. Okay? So that's very important here. That make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good question. Okay. All right, I think now we're going to leave object relations, and this is just the shortest skimming of object relations theory. Dr. Baker used to teach a class, Freud and Object Relations, here as a seminar class. I don't think he's done it for a while. I've thought about teaching that class at some point, or teaching it with him, and spending a whole semester just digging into this object relation stuff. Very interesting for those of you who are thinking about going on to clinical work. I don't know. The problem with these classes, I'm not sure I ever get enough people who want to take it, but we do have a class here. Dr. Baker does a good job of teaching it. He's very, very knowledgeable in this stuff. So if you see that on the schedule anytime, I would encourage you, if this is interesting, to take it. So we're just really skimming the surface here. This gets a lot deeper. And I'll give you a little more about this stuff when we get into talking about narcissism, when I talk about personality disorders. Okay, so Chodorow talks about family structures and a bunch of other stuff here, you know, and again, there's a lot of things we could be thinking about here. Are women better caretakers, especially at a young age? Is a heterosexual man or woman the ideal parenting unit? And I will say here that everything here, it just depends. You know, the big thing about gay families, you know, two men raising a kid, you know, oh my gosh, you know, they're going to lose out. Not necessarily. You know, mother raising a son without a father around, that's my situation, right? I grew up with that. You know, were there problems? Could be, could not be. Just depends. I know when I was growing up, I had lots of father figures in my life that I got a lot of father stuff from that I wasn't getting necessarily from my dad. And so again, you know, children can be very resilient. So all these kind of questions, the short answer is it just depends. Now, you also may have religious or cultural beliefs that feed into these things too, and so that's something to take into consideration. Corporal punishment for kids. Should we spank your kids? Should we hit the kids? Should we put the kids in a room by themselves and isolate them? You know, how do those fit into this stuff? Lots of questions we could ask here. And again, I will refer you to other classes. We have parenting classes. We have a good parenting class here. If you take that, you can get more into this stuff. But it's important stuff, okay? Okay, so let's talk about this relational cultural theory now. Again, this is something I don't know much about, so I'm going to not go into too much detail about it. Make sure you're reading the book. It's facilitated by this Stone Center for Developmental Services and Studies at Wesleyan College in Massachusetts, which I believe is or was an all-women's college. I may be wrong about that, but we can check on that. They came up with a collaborative theory of human development within relationships. So this is the big difference with this stuff. So this is a theory that the critique of Freud and Freudians who come along, and even Jungians, it would be a critique of Jungians too, is that everybody has been focusing on the child separating and individuating into this individual ego, this separate person, and that the goal, the unconscious or the subliminal goal of all these psychologies is for the person to become a separate, isolated individual. And these relational cultural people say no. What's going on here is that the person, as they develop, they are learning to have more complicated and subtle relationships as they go along. They're learning to become relational masters. And they started simple relationships, just dyadic, then they moved to triadic, then they moved to societal relationships. And as they develop, that they are able to master more and more complicated human relationships. And the pathology stems when these relationships are when the person's not able to have relationships, when they're not able to develop the ability to have relationships appropriate with whatever level. And that's roughly this theory in a nutshell. That things are, that we've really been looking at the wrong thing. We've been looking at people become separate individuals, and we should really be looking at how well they are able to relate to each other. So again, it's sort of flipping, developmental psychology on its head, and really looking at sort of the development of relational ability. Okay. And so this is this collaborative theory of human development. Now they talk a lot about the psychology of development of the sexes being constrained and contorted by the framework of inequity. In other words, not to disparage this, because I think there's a lot of truth to this, but that women in a lot of societies are treated unequally, and so this distorts their development from as children to adulthood. This distorts their development. That's the main idea. And then this would also be worse for women of color and women who are from other, minority groups, or women of color, or gays or lesbians, or anybody who's sort of subject to being outside of the norm of the society. Okay. So, I think I'm of two minds about this. Part of me thinks that, I'm a man, heterosexual man, so I think like, well, okay, that's probably true. I can't comment on that because I haven't had those experiences, so I can't comment on that. And the other part of me sort of says, the devil's advocate says, well, yeah, that's sort of obvious that certain people are going to have harder time than other people, but can we make the claim that affects our development as human beings? And part of me is saying, I'm not sure about that. So again, you can read this and come to your own conclusion about it. I encourage you to do that. If you think what they're talking about is really true, or do you think that something else is going on here, that people you can make the real devil's advocate argument is that people have a certain developmental pathway, and then that causes them when they grow over to adapt certain behaviors which may engender in that society them being treated unequally, which they would not like that idea. They like the other way around. The inequity comes first, and that's causing problems. Probably, in my opinion, the truth is somewhere in between both. Now, obviously, there's some things you can't help. If you're born a female, you're born a female. And if you're treated bad because you're a female, then that's going to be nothing you can do about that as far as society is concerned. Except if you're a therapist and somebody comes into you for therapy and they're talking to you, that to try to help them understand the inequity in the world so that they can try to negotiate that better, right? And the idea that will become over time, our society will become less and less unequal. And I don't know about you guys, but we still got a lot of progress. In my opinion, I think we still have a lot of progress to make. There's a lot of inequity out in the world. Some inequity may be part of our biological heritage. That may be part of being creatures that exist in dominance hierarchies and people striving to have superiority over other people all the time. That seems to be kind of a primate pattern, and that may lead to inequity, especially if somebody is in some way perceived as different than the majority. So that could cause a problem. But they write a lot about that here. Now, women have critical strength largely unrecognized by society that can bring creative force to human problems. I see this again as another recasting of Karen Horney's womb envy theory. And again, that women, because of their procreative capacities, I like to say that because of women have a certain superpower that men don't have, that they get the short end of the stick because of this. Men denigrate them, men devalue their abilities. Men devalue the superpower women have of being able to have babies, and they devalue the superpower that women have of being able to form very intense relationships where they can communicate very effectively a lot of emotional states that men have a harder time doing. And the idea here is that then women get put down by at least some societies for this, and their skills and powers are devalued. And again, I think this is just restating what Karen Horney said. And again, I think you can look around and see that there's some truth in this. I mean, what do you guys think? The women in the class, you think this is true? You think that the superpowers that you have as women are devalued in a male society? Maybe in a workplace, someplace like that. Anybody have that experience? No? No, you think you're being treated pretty equally? What do you think? Yeah?
I don't feel like, I know it happens, but I don't feel like I have been treated like, oh, because you're a girl.
Yeah. Well, have you ever been treated, I'm sorry, go ahead, Myra.
I feel the fact that it took so many of us to even say anything already proves that we are intimidated to speak up.
Oh.
The fact alone that, I mean, I know we've all probably been
Oh, that's interesting.
looked down upon at one point.
So if a woman were running the class, teaching the class, you think people would be more open to talking about it?
I mean, I had the class last semester with Dr. Gray,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of women, and they were, from what I noticed, a lot more open than I've seen in other classes.
Yeah,
That one in my Chicano classes, the women in those two were very vocal
yeah,
compared to my other courses.
yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, I mean, it may be, I mean, you have an impressive male, running the class, you probably don't want to say anything, I get it. No, I mean, unconsciously, you're not consciously thinking that, but it may be, you don't feel safe to express that, that feeling, because there might be repercussions, but that's what these guys would say. That's what these guys would say.